this bike runs. This story does have a happy ending, but it took a lot to get here. Hey there YouTube, Travis here. Let's do a quick recap on this Honda Hobbit. So again, this is a 1978 Honda Hobbit. It was last featured in my hardwiring video where we did a simple hardwire of this bike. The wiring is absolutely not cleaned up yet because I was focused on getting it running. This is what I consider to be a worst case scenario bike for getting your hands on an old used moped. This isn't an all original factory bike that's just been sitting for a long time. This is indeed someone else's project, which about 8 years ago they started and gave up on. So as a recap, this bike had an absolutely horrendous wiring job when I got it. It had this wizard kit installed, which is probably an okay kit. It looks like it was barely run. Had this super strange cut open and re-welded stock exhaust and a couple other just really questionable weird things about it. And this bike was so frustrating because it would absolutely not run. On the surface, it appears I had spark, compression, and fuel, and I was still not getting anything. And in general, this advice is pretty commonplace. If you have spark, compression, and fuel, the bike must run. It has no choice. Or does it? So let's set the stage. This is what would happen when I tried to start the bike.
Oh, you see that fire?
No.
That's a flame.
From
Here.
In order to troubleshoot this bike further, I made a little list of things that it could be. What could the culprit be for this bike not to run? So first was my timing off. So you can absolutely have spark, but if it's sparking at the wrong time, the bike will not run. It could be my crank seals. So you can have bad crank seals, especially if it's a 35-year-old moped. Even if it's new crank seals, there are absolutely cases where the seal could have a factory defect. Maybe you were a little quick when you installed it. One of the springs popped out. It got twisted somehow. It can happen. So that's one thing it could be. Another issue that's brought up online pretty frequently is a clogged exhaust. I went ahead and grabbed a nearly new Chroma pipe to install on here just to be sure that I wasn't dealing with a clogged pipe. Normally, that's like a resurrection thing where if you have an old high mileage moped, the muffler could be full of carbon. Not in this case though. And then the final one is you actually have low compression. Despite your goodwill and what you think are good parts, that could very well be the case. So I did the needful. We started testing and going down our list. So I really suspected my ignition was the problem, and a lot of people online did as well. The Hobbit is nice in that there's a mark on the case from the factory, and there's also top dead center mark and a fire mark. So even if the bike doesn't run, you can test for ignition timing. You put a drill on the nut for the stator, hook up a timing light to a battery, and then turn the bike over and see where we're at. In this case, my timing was pretty darn close to that F mark. It was maybe a millimeter or two off, but that certainly wouldn't give us a no start condition. So next, of course, is the crank seals. I am trying to cowboy this bike back to life without doing a full engine rebuild, trying to do this on the cheap. But engine seals are cheap, so they're a great thing to check, especially on a Hobbit where because the case is split vertically instead of horizontally like a Pookie 50, you can actually replace the crank seals without splitting the cases, and that's what I did. So I pulled apart the stator all the way down to the stator side seal. I was looking for like some seeping black goop around the seal, some indication that it was leaking. I didn't see it though. I replaced it for good measure. When I replace the seals, I do just some whatever grease on the inside of the seal to make sure they slide onto the crank really nice, just a little bit on the inside. And then on the outside of the seal, I'll go ahead and put some Moto Seal. This is the same thing you'd use to do case halves on an E50. A little bit on the outside, not a whole heck of a lot, and get that into position. Now, when I went to go check the variator side seal, I was greeted with a surprise, and I'm really glad that I checked the seals because when I took the starter clutch off, the seal fell off in my hand. Well, that should be it, right? It wasn't. At this point, both crank seals are replaced. In order to fully eliminate the air leak variable, I replaced all the gaskets. So we got a nice new exhaust gasket, which I think I had on there anyway when I put this pipe on. I cut new gaskets, or a new base gasket for the kit. And around this time, I swapped to a known good top end. This is a Parma kit, which came off a running bike. Cut a new base gasket for it, had a new head gasket. The reed block, which normally doesn't have gaskets, I painstakingly cut gaskets for it just to be absolutely sure in case the rubber on the reed block was no longer doing its job. So at this point, we have new crank seals, all new gaskets around, very carefully torqued to spec, around 6 or 7 foot-pounds all around, just to be absolutely sure we didn't have massive air leaks here. And what was the result of all this? So this is where things got really maddening for me. At this point, we have spark, we have a good top end that I pulled off a running bike. Our fuel flow from the petcock to the carb is great. The reeds are getting wet. The carb has been cleaned 3 times, especially the emulsion tube in the carb, which you have to hit on a wooden table to get that to come out. All the passages in there are squeaky clean. I've literally pulled that carb apart 3 times, gone through every inch of it. I can find no imperfections. It's worth mentioning the spark plug is not wet. I can't really explain this, but what I've been doing is taking the extra long fuel line for the carburetor, putting it into the spark plug hole, letting a little bit of premix go in there, pulling it out to simulate fuel in the cylinder. In my mind, if I have fuel, spark, and compression, we should run. Normally, when you have a loud popping sound, that is almost always an ignition issue. And that's what a lot of people online, and even the great Will from my videos and years past, who I was texting throughout all this, thought as well. I wanted to be sure that I eliminated any variable I could, so I went ahead, I pulled out a perfectly good working complete ignition from coil to stator to spark plug wire from a different bike that I had upgraded to a CDI, which was running perfectly fine. Painstakingly swapped all that in, made sure I kept all the components the same, so that flywheel for that stator, everything in. And what did I get? Well, I got great spark, just like I did with my first ignition, but it would not run. And yes, through all of this, my Woodruff key was very intact. That is also a very telltale thing for loud popping and a no start scenario. So when you're in this incredibly frustrating situation, the mind can go to all sorts of wild and wacky places. I was still fixated on this ignition. I was certain that there had to be something here that I was missing. I was using a different cam, the cam that opens the points with the other flywheel setup, but I was still curious, what's the only remaining variable, the crank? I had a wild thought that, I know that the variator side of the Hobbit crank can bend. What if this unknown crank is messed up or out of round enough to where, it's making the whole cam just be a little bit cockeyed and not opening the points right and somehow still lining up with the timing mark? I don't know. What it ended up being was absolutely not a bent crank or anything else. You'll notice we have one last item to think about, which is, do you have low compression when you think you don't have low compression? So yes, it was time to put a compression tester on this bike and actually see what the results were. Now, to be honest, this was a little difficult for me. I really truly believe that mopeds can be fixed with a very simple tool set, and other than maybe a flywheel puller or a clutch puller, depending on the bike, you really shouldn't need fancy expensive tools in order to work on old 2-stroke mopeds. But in this case, I do own a compression tester. Everyone hates these. I hate this one especially. This is your run-of-the-mill Harbor Freight compression tester. It's really meant for cars. On any small engine, really, it's going to read low because of this extremely long hose. But that's really one of the only affordable options out there for a compression tester. So in this case, I'll show some pictures here. It's time for me to eat my humble pie. This compression tester normally reads around 40 PSI on a good running bike. Hooked up to this moped, it showed like 5 or less than 5. It's really hard to tell on this tiny gauge. So how could this be? Normally for a low compression reading like that, you expect to see a broken piston ring at the very least, but this top end is still in good shape. It ran pretty well on the bike I pulled it off of. The culprit is right here. Now, when this top end was on my other bike and running just fine, it was running with this. This is a Xiling head, specifically cut for 46 millimeter Honda kits, originally for a DR kit. And this head is pretty sweet. It does not have a decomp. It's huge for more cooling. I really like this head, but you can't use it with a stock setup like this because the stock head bolts are not long enough. You would either need longer head bolts or more likely you'll convert to studs because that's way better. But in any case, I went ahead and reused the same head that this bike came with, which is actually this head. And you know, when I would operate the decomp, it felt crunchy, but I assumed that was a crunchy cable and it did move, but really all it was doing is when you pull on this, it was really just bending the piece of metal up here. This decomp is very stuck. It is so stuck, and this variable right here, which I assumed early on, you know, if the decomp is stuck closed, I mean, it's just stuck closed, it isn't gonna hurt it. But in this case, for whatever reason, this decomp is so messed up, it's giving us a very low compression reading. I went into my parts bin, I grabbed a random other stock head from there that seemed to have a functional decomp, popped it on here, put our compression tester back on, and we're right up to around 40 PSI, right where this reader says is healthy for an engine. And sure enough, this thing fired right up. Okay, so what did we learn today? As eager as we are to get something working and running right, can't make assumptions. You really can't make assumptions about the parts that you have. It's really easy to throw parts at something. It's much harder to properly diagnose something, but that's going to actually get you to a running bike. And I want to give a quick shout out. I was posting around on the internet for some tips for things I could be missing on this bike. I got some super helpful suggestions from folks out there. So if you happen to interact with me personally on that and gave me some suggestions for this bike, I appreciate it. Helping each other out online is exactly how we all get a little better at this. Okay there, YouTube. Well, hopefully you enjoyed this troubleshooting saga. It ended up being something really simple that was keeping this bike from working, but now it does, and it runs pretty well. With that Parma kit and that Promo circuit pipe, it pulls pretty hard. So I'm out here having a lot of fun with it. We're definitely not done with this bike. There's absolutely a lot more to do before it's something that's considered done, but we'll get there. Okay, YouTube, until next time.